the draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of the Observer State of Palestine.
Thank you, Madam President. There is no right to mass killing of civilians. There is no right to starve an entire civilian population. There is no right to forcibly displace a people. And there is no right to annexation. This is what Israel is doing in Gaza. These are its war objectives. This is what the absence of a ceasefire is allowing it to continue doing. This full-fledged Israeli assault against the Palestinian people and the Palestinian land is about everything except the hostages. If the families of hostages can see that, how can anyone in this room claim otherwise? A ceasefire will allow to save lives, all lives. This was true a year ago. This is even more true today. A ceasefire doesn't resolve everything, but it is the first step towards resolving anything. And what is the answer of those who are still unwilling now, after all this death and destruction, not to call for an unconditional ceasefire? Is it to accept that the killing should continue until we resolve everything while we watch that we are resolving nothing? We heard over and over again statements in this chamber by all members without distinction about protection of civilians, about rejecting forcible displacement, about rejecting starving the Palestinian population, about rejecting annexation, about rejecting wanton destruction, about rejecting regional escalation. Everyone around this table agreed on these objectives, and yet here we are. 44,000 Palestinians killed. This is those who are accounted for. Many more are not accounted for. One day we will retrieve them in mass graves under the rubbles, and we will discover the real numbers of this horror. And there will be many that we will never retrieve. Famine that is looming all over Gaza, that is a reality in northern Gaza. 2 million people displaced, still hunted even when they are in tents. Total destruction of Gaza and all the requirements of life in it. And war on Lebanon, its people and its sovereignty. What does it mean to proclaim all these principles, we reject, we reject, we reject, and then shield Israel of the consequences of its actions, thus allowing it to do exactly what we're asking it to stop doing? Madam President, the world should not grow accustomed to the death of Palestinians, to seeing Palestinian children starving, to seeing mothers carrying their children from one place to another, forcibly displaced. They should not get accustomed to seeing journalists killed and humanitarians killed, to see Palestinians detained, abducted, carried on trucks to go be tortured, sexually abused, and raped. The fact we are Palestinians does not make that less shocking or less outrageous. Maybe for some we have the wrong nationality, the wrong faith, the wrong skin color. But we are humans, and we should be treated as such. Is there a UN charter for Israel that is different from the charter you all have? Tell us. Is there an international law for them, an international law for us? Do they have the right to kill, and the only right we have is to die? What the hell does Israel need to do more for this council to act under Chapter 7? What more can they do for this council to act under Chapter 7? Or will this council be the last place on earth that cannot recognize a threat to peace when they see it? When it is so glaring, so undeniable. You are witnessing the attempt to annihilate a nation, destroy a nation. It is not even hidden. It is in plain sight. And yet the very tools designed to respond to these situations are not being used. So which one is it? Are Palestinian lives not worth saving? Or does Israel have a license to kill? Can this council only adopt resolutions and then witness their blatant breach? This self-inflicted powerlessness has to stop. And like Algeria, we repeat, the resolutions of this council are binding. Their role is to be enforced. Their role is to change reality, not to record violations for history's purposes and then allow them to continue. Had diplomatic efforts succeeded, we would not be here. We recognize all the efforts that were done, all the diplomatic efforts that were conducted. And yet, we have to recognize children are still starving in Gaza. Families are being killed. Communities are being obliterated. Had these efforts succeeded, we would not be here. But what we cannot accept is that Israel has a veto that blocks any attempts to put an end to this war, especially when we know what are its true intentions. Madam President, many peoples, many governments around the world are saying the right things and trying to do the right things. And we have here to express our gratitude to the E10 for their relentless efforts for over a year now, and in the recent month. We all were hoping that 2735 would lead to a ceasefire. And we can discuss who is responsible for that ceasefire not occurring. For us, it is pretty clear that Israel had never an intention to accept a ceasefire and has found every reason not to have a ceasefire. We thank Guyana for its efforts in coordinating the E10 initiative. We thank all of those who have voted in favor of this resolution, and we agree with Malta and with Algeria. This is the bare minimum. This is the bare minimum that morality, humanity, legality would plead for. And this bare minimum, even this bare minimum, was vetoed. I truly do not understand, and you're saying we cannot be for an unconditional ceasefire. What that means in effect now is that we are for a war. You're saying we cannot be for an unconditional ceasefire that does not release the hostages. Is this war releasing the hostages? Is it even trying to release the hostages? So what does it mean? We accept this war that is killing hostages and that is killing, maiming, terrorizing, destroying an entire nation. When is it enough? When is it the point where we say, no, we mean ceasefire now, now. We will not allow you to not listen to us, to ignore us, to insult us, to play games with us. This resolution is trying to restore life, to save lives. It's not a dangerous message. The draft resolution is not a dangerous message. This veto is a dangerous message to Israel that it can continue executing its plans, the very plans you oppose. And the messages we send do matter. And that is the wrong message at the worst possible time. Israel is responsible for the Palestinian civilians it kills. It cannot be absolved of that responsibility. It is killing them purposefully, deliberately, repeatedly, massively. It is starving them on purpose. Nobody can deny it. We sat in this room, we heard every UN agency, every testimony, every NGO, Palestinian, Israeli, international, saying the same things. This is by design. What does it mean that release of the hostages should be unconditional? This is what the Council has said repeatedly now for a year. Release of hostages should be unconditional. But stopping killing Palestinians is conditional? There are acceptable conditions to stop the mass killing of Palestinians? There's 100 Israeli hostages, and there's 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. They deserve better. They deserve respect for their lives, for their suffering. Israel will always claim conditions have not been met because its plans require it to continue this war, to annex the land and destroy the people. and therefore we can no longer accept its conditions. 14 months, and we are still debating if a genocide must be stopped. There's no justification whatsoever for vetoing a resolution trying to stop atrocities. No justification for that. Madam President, one day someone will dig up these meetings, the records of them, will see us pleading for the lives of our people over and over and over and over again. And they will try to understand why our calls were not heeded. They will look at the people who sat around this table and spoke and addressed you from all over the world to call on the Council to take action. They will read what everybody here has said, and then they will wonder how a genocide displayed on TVs known to the whole world was able to continue for this long. They will wonder if the whole world is against the mass killing, against the displacement, against the starvation, against the annexation, how come they all occurred? It is because we are allowed to speak about the rules, but not to enforce them. Because we can regret and reject, but not act. There are many states now stepping up to change this reality. We call on all states and all peoples to stand for life, for freedom, and for peace. We are out of time. We repeat, we are against harming any civilians. And we have more than our share of grievances. We could have sat here and tried to justify harming civilians. We never did, not one day. And we're still sitting here after tens of thousands of our people have been killed, many have been detained, all have been traumatized, all have been displaced. We have many reasons to say otherwise, and yet we remain steadfast. There is no reason to harm civilians, regardless of their nationality, their origin, regardless of the circumstances. But our civilians, what about our civilians? They are worthy of protection. Their lives should be saved. People cannot sit and demand Palestinian pacifism under all circumstances and enable Israeli militarism. That cannot be done. Either you believe violence is an impasse, you believe there are no military solutions, and then you act for peaceful ones and reject military ones, or you let it be military. We are for a peaceful path. Even after all that has happened, we are for a peaceful path. Help us chart it, not block it. Stop them. Help us. You would be helping Palestinians and Israelis in our region and the world. Madam President, there is a world out there where Palestinian children are able to grow. We are not born to be occupied and killed and displaced. That's not our destiny, that's not our fate. There is a world where we could live and grow and see our children grow with no occupation, no bombs, no tents, no settlements, no walls, no military checkpoints, no prisons, no constant humiliation, no oppression, no house demolished, no amputations, no pain and no agony. That world can exist today if we were to act. And the fact we are not means that many, many more Palestinians will suffer and others will suffer. We are trying to get there. We are trying to find a path that leads us there, to freedom, to life, and to peace. That should be our common objective. There is a world where there's no war in the Middle East, where Palestinians and Israeli civilians go about their lives, where maybe they can look confidently towards the future and even envisage more bridges between them, where our region unleashes its true and full potential for the benefit of all states and all peoples. It's this future that is being destroyed before our very eyes. And the entire Palestinian civilian population is the primary victim. Madam President, we call on the General Assembly to uphold the responsibilities that the Council has failed to uphold owing to the US veto. We call on all states to use all available tools to stop the massacres. What this resolution was calling for is an unconditional end to massacres, and that is always worth supporting.
who wish to make statements before the vote. I give the floor to Guyana.
Thank you, Madam President, for so swiftly facilitating the request to convene this meeting. I have the honor to introduce this draft resolution on behalf of the 10 elected member states of the Security Council, namely Algeria, Ecuador, Japan, Malta, Mozambique, Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, Slovenia, Switzerland, and my own country, Guyana. The resolution before the Council is the product of several weeks of consultations among all Council members. It was prompted by the Council's deep concern over the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza, including what was unfolding in North Gaza, and the need for an urgent response to that situation. I take this opportunity to thank all delegations for their very constructive stance throughout the negotiations. Your flexibility has allowed us to develop a text which we feel responds to many critical elements of the conflict. Madam President, the text before us recalls the Security Council's primary responsibility to uphold international peace and security and demands an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire to be respected by all parties, and reiterates the Council's demand for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. This is one of the most important provisions of the text, since it addresses some of the most fundamental concerns regarding the ongoing hostilities. The text also demands that the parties comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. Emphasis is also placed on the last 4 resolutions adopted by the Council in relation to this conflict, reaffirming the provisions of those resolutions and demanding in particular the full and unconditional implementation of Resolution 2735 adopted in June. Critically, the draft also demands immediate access by the civilian population in the Gaza Strip to basic services and humanitarian assistance indispensable to its survival, while rejecting any effort to starve Palestinians. It also demands the facilitation of full, rapid, safe, and unhindered entry of humanitarian assistance at scale to and throughout the Gaza Strip, and the delivery of that assistance to all Palestinian civilians who need it, including to civilians in besieged North Gaza. The draft resolution acknowledges UNRWA as the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza and calls on all parties to enable the agency to carry out its mandate in all areas of operation. Madam President, the text represents a broad consensus achieved on the basis of careful, inclusive, and transparent negotiations. While several divergent positions have found a balance in the text, the dominant concern has been to provide a legally binding obligation to end the hostilities in Gaza. The E10 sincerely hopes that all delegations will support the text, since it aligns with our Charter responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. I thank you.
The representative of Guyana for their statement. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favour of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024-835 please raise their hand? Those against? The result of the voting is as follows: 14 votes in favour, 1 vote against, 0 abstentions. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council. And I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Madam President, at the outset, I extend my gratitude to those who voted in favor of the draft resolution presented by the 10 elected members who are the representative of the collective will of the international community. It is a sad day for the Security Council, for the United Nations, and for the international community as a whole. The draft resolution this Council failed to adopt today sought only to break its deafening silence 5 months after the adoption of the resolution 2735. 5 months during which the Security Council remained idle, remained hand-tied. This text was far from ideal, but it represented the bare minimum that should have united us. Algeria, my country, has consistently called for enforcing Security Council decisions and imposing sanctions on those who defy the collective will of the international community. For this reason, our position was to adopt a resolution under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. There were significant concessions during negotiations, yet one member chose to block any action from this Council. Today's message is clear. To the Israeli occupying power first. You may continue your genocide. You may continue your collective punishment of the Palestinian people with complete impunity. In this chamber, you enjoy immunity. To the Palestinian people, another clear message. While the overwhelming majority of the world stands in solidarity with your plight, tragically, others remain indifferent to your suffering. Madam President, we must ask ourselves today, as human beings, is it not enough that 44,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, 70% of whom are women and children? How many more must perish before this Council imposes a ceasefire? Is it not enough that the number of orphans in Gaza now range between 17,000 and 18,000, many of whom have no surviving family members to care for them? Gaza. Gaza, once known as a city of children, has tragically become a city of orphans. How many more children must be orphaned before this council takes actions? Is it not enough that over 170 journalists have been killed in Gaza? And how many more journalists must die before this council acts? Colleagues, Israel, the occupying power, has killed more journalists in 1 year than those lost in World War II and the Vietnam War combined. Where are those? Where are those who proclaim to be defenders of human rights and freedom of expression? Why are they silent in the face of such atrocities? Is it not enough that at least 326 aid workers have been killed? The highest number ever recorded in history. How many more must sacrifice their lives before this council decides sanctions? Is it not enough that over 1,000 health workers have been killed? How many more must fall before this council takes decisive action? Is it not enough that almost the entire population of Gaza has been forcibly displaced and face famine now, with some already succumbing to hunger? How many more must starve to death before this council responds? Madam President, in the past year, the Council adopted 4 resolutions. Negotiations were conducted. Calls from every corner of the globe were made. Yet, nothing has stopped the Israeli killing machine in Gaza. And the reason is painfully clear. Israeli leaders operate with the full knowledge that they enjoy impunity. They enjoy immunity. They are certain that this body, the Security Council, tasked with maintaining international peace and security by the UN Charter, will be prevented on acting to halt the genocide. Today, we have missed an opportunity. This failure that will have devastating consequences for the international order. But rest assured this will not be the last time the Security Council will be forced to address a resolution on Palestine. As we have said before, and as we have delivered, we will soon return to the Security Council to demand an immediate and unconditional and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. And this time, with even a firmer language under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. And our efforts will not cease until the Council make a decisive action. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, China is very disappointed with the result of today's vote. Guyana, Algeria, and other E10 members of the Council demonstrated maximum amount of sincerity and constructiveness during the consultation of the draft resolution. The U.S. long use of the veto has dashed the hope of the people of Gaza for survival, pushing them further into darkness and desperation. I said during the Council's debate on Monday that every moment will be recorded in history and will be judged by history. We cannot imagine how the vote today, as well as the Security Council's failure to respond to the Gaza's conflict over the past 13 months, can escape the harsh judgment of history. In the future, when looking back, people will find it hard to believe what happened. When the US cast its first veto on 18 October last year, nearly 3,000 civilians had been killed in Gaza. By the time the US cast its second veto, 17,000 people had been killed as a result of Israeli bombardment. With each veto, the death toll in Gaza continued to rise. With the US exercising its veto for the fifth time on April 18th this year, the death toll in Gaza stood at some 34,000. Now that nearly 44,000 people has been killed in Gaza, yet the United States still did not hesitate to use its veto. 44,000. It is not some cold statistics. It could be a miner, a nursing mother, or the breadwinner of a family. The loss of each and every one of them means internal pain for the surviving relatives. People cannot help but to ask, do Palestinian lives mean nothing? Can't the deaths of 44,000 people win even a little bit of sympathy from the United States? How many more people have to die before they wake up from their pretend slumber? In the future, when looking back, people will find it hard to understand what happened. The Security Council is mandated under the UN Charter to shoulder the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. It is incomprehensible why, for the past years or so, the United States has been so insistent in rendering the Council incapable of playing its role, leading to its paralysis. The US claims to be conducting parallel diplomatic efforts and has repeatedly promised that progress would be made soon in the negotiations. It is incomprehensible then why, to date, the so-called diplomatic negotiations has seen no progress. Why is Israel allowed to continue its military operations while consistently putting forth new conditions for negotiations? In the future, when looking back, people will find it inevitable to feel indignant. Israel has flagrantly breached every red line of international humanitarian law, with its actions causing an unprecedented humanitarian disaster. But even as famine is imminent in Gaza, the United States always seems to be able to find a justification to defend Israel. This represents a distortion and selective disregard of the applicable IHL. People keep learning something new they never knew before was possible, and how low one can stoop. No wonder people feel angry. People's indignation also stems from the fact that the continued supply of weapons from the US has become a decisive factor in the war lasting so long, causing so many casualties and so much destruction. President, the US representative earlier called for the release of hostages in the statement. Our position has been very clear from the beginning. All hostages must be released. An immediate and unconditional ceasefire must be established. Both are important factors. There should be no any conditionality. They cannot be linked to each other. Because facts have shown that Israel's military operations in Gaza have long exceeded the scope of rescuing hostages. Insistence on setting a precondition for ceasefire is tantamount to giving the green light to continuing the war and condoning the continued killing. The repeated use of veto by the United States has reduced the authority of the Security Council and international law to an all-time low, but it is never too late to recognize mistakes made and take corrective actions. We call on the US to take its responsibilities as a permanent member of the Council seriously. US should stop being passive and evasive, stop dragging its feet deliberately. The US should adopt an attitude accountable to history and support the Council in taking all necessary actions to achieve a ceasefire, save lives, and restore peace. And I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Slovenia voted in favor of the draft resolution, focusing on the demand for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire. We thank Guyana for the able steering of E10 efforts as the coordinator and the other E10 members for the excellent cooperation in presenting this resolution. Since the start of the war in Gaza more than a year ago, Slovenia has been continuously calling for a strong, united voice from the Council on this issue. We have been supportive of every effort to find that unified response. It is undisputable that this Council is a primary body entrusted with the maintenance of international peace and security. It is the responsibility of every member state to contribute. As an elected member, our sense of responsibility has been growing. The war has brought pain and destruction, confrontations and shockwaves, limitation and attacks on the UN, and violations of international law. From the terrorist attack of Hamas on October 7th, the relentless attacks on civilians and limitation of humanitarian assistance in Gaza, including the siege of northern Gaza and unprecedented obstructions of UNRWA operations, this war represents everything the UN Charter stands against. We regret the veto has been cast. Even more, since this war was its humanitarian impact and spillover effect amounts to a serious threat to international peace and security. We deeply appreciate the work done by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States aimed at reaching a ceasefire deal on the ground. As we clearly stated during the adoption of the Resolution 2735, we believe that calls by the international community, efforts by mediators, and those of a bilateral nature are intertwined and should be mutually reinforcing. Madam President, the suffering in Gaza must end. The suffering of people in Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, and in wider region must end. There must be an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire. Hostages must be released. Humanitarian aid must be scaled up. We have heard countless briefings making it crystal clear. We must act now. It is this Council's responsibility to react to threats to international peace and security. There is an entire generation of children in Gaza that we are failing. They lost their families, their communities, schools, friends, their childhood. This is a war that the Council can and must stop with a united and unequivocal demand for a ceasefire. This is the first step towards achieving a comprehensive solution to the conflict, a first step to give those children a future. Slovenia will support further steps to peace, including an international peace conference and a commitment to global alliance for the implementation of the two-state solution, so that the future generations in Israel and Palestine can live side by side in peace, security, and prosperity. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. Since the adoption of Resolution 2735 this past June, the Security Council has been hoping and expecting the finalization of the deal to achieve an immediate ceasefire and the release of all hostages in Gaza. As the president of this council in June, I remember how desperately all council members aspired for the swift implementation of this resolution, which urges both parties, notably Hamas, to accept the proposed agreement. Since then, 5 months have passed, and the conflict has brought even more death, misery, and destruction to Palestinian civilians and Israeli hostages. And it is deeply disappointing that in spite of the efforts by mediators, US, Egypt, and Qatar, Resolution 2735 has yet to be implemented. The Republic of Korea still hopes that those diplomatic efforts will lead to a fruitful outcome that accomplishes an immediate ceasefire along with the release of all hostages. Madam President, as repeatedly pointed out, under this ceaseless armed conflict in Gaza, humanitarian efforts cannot deliver substantive results. An immediate ceasefire is not only an option, it is the only way to save lives in Gaza. This is why the 10 elected members of the Council, including the Republic of Korea, commenced a new initiative demanding an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, and in parallel, demanding an immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. It is regrettable that the draft resolution could not garner the support needed to be adopted today. However, we do believe that all members of the Security Council agree on the imperative of an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, though members may have different views on how to arrive at the goal. Thus, the Republic of Korea will not lose hope for a ceasefire and the release of all hostages at the earliest possible juncture. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, let me express appreciation to Guyana for its important role in pushing forward this important initiative for resolution. It has been more than 400 days since Hamas and others killed more than 1,200 Israelis and took more than 200 hostages, which Japan firmly condemns. Until now, the devastation in Gaza has shown no signs of abating, with tens of thousands of civilian casualties, an appalling death toll of UN personnel and humanitarian aid workers, and massive displacement. Given the ever-worsening situation, this draft resolution, if adopted, would have been a much-needed pronouncement by the Security Council demanding an immediate ceasefire, as well as an immediate release of all hostages. This passage could also have sent a strong message towards a dramatic expansion of humanitarian aid throughout the Strip, in particular to the most vulnerable Palestinians in the north. Therefore, Japan joined all the other elected members as co-pen holders of this draft resolution and voted in favor. It is deeply regrettable that we could not come to a text which all the Council members can accept. However, now is not that moment to trade accusations for the continuation of this nightmare. The Council member that could not support the draft resolution is working tirelessly to end the agony in Gaza, and Japan continues to support their diplomatic efforts. Madam President, despite today's setback, we should not stop working to improve the catastrophic situation on the ground. Today is World Children's Day, but without our collective actions, the children in Gaza, the future of Gaza, will continue to pay the high price of this conflict. This Council must keep their plight in mind as we work to immediately bring about a long-awaited ceasefire. Japan remains steadfastly committed to this end, both here at this Council and through multilateral and bilateral channels as well. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank all the elected members, in particular our coordinator from Guyana, for their tireless efforts for urgent and necessary action by this Council, and I thank all of the members that supported our resolution. As the co-sponsor, Switzerland voted in favor of this draft resolution and regrets that it was not adopted due to the veto of a permanent member. More than 5 months after the adoption of Resolution 2735, this draft reaffirmed our commitment to an immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire, to the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, and to the safe, rapid and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid to the civilian population. Switzerland would like to underscore that the obligations of the parties in this matter continue, regardless of whether or not resolutions are adopted by this Council. It is high time that the parties respected these obligations and protected civilians and civilian infrastructure in accordance with international humanitarian law. The violence and dehumanization in this conflict must end. I would like to underline the strong commitment of the group of elected members to unified action by the Council. The Council can continue to count on us for future action to promote peace and security between Israelis and Palestinians and in the region as a whole. Madam President, the situation is urgent. In Gaza, civilians are exposed to hostilities, incessant displacement, epidemics, and the risk of imminent famine, while the hospital system has been almost completely destroyed. As the occupying power, Israel has a duty to ensure that the basic needs of the population in the occupied Palestinian territory are met. This Council must also act in accordance with its mandate to bring about a ceasefire, release all hostages, and protect civilians, including humanitarian personnel, particularly those of the UN. There must be an end to human suffering, a halt to the escalation of violence in the region, and the foundations laid for the solution of 2 democratic states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders. Switzerland will continue to support all efforts in this direction. Thank you.
Thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Kingdom. I'd like to start by thanking Guyana and the E10 for their tireless work on this resolution. The United Kingdom voted for this resolution as an expression of our determination to end this war, stop the suffering in Gaza, and secure the immediate release of the hostages. The UK remains resolute in our call for an immediate ceasefire, the immediate release of all hostages cruelly held by Hamas since the 7th of October 2023, and urgent action to address the humanitarian crisis. The deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Gaza is catastrophic and unacceptable. All of Gaza is at the risk of famine, and in some areas, this is likely to be imminent. Yet the aid reaching civilians remains entirely insufficient to mitigate this unfolding disaster. The unthinkable hardship that civilians are already facing in Gaza is set to get even worse as winter approaches. Israel must take urgent action to alleviate this crisis. International humanitarian law must be respected by all sides. We regret that the Council was unable to reach consensus on this issue. But colleagues, we remain committed to the vision of this text, and we will keep striving alongside our partners to bring this war to a close, to secure the release of the hostages, and to secure a huge scale-up in aid and to protect civilians. And I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Madam President. After 5 weeks of intense negotiations and a vote in favor by 14 members of this Council, Guyana deeply regrets that we were unable today to adopt the resolution tabled by the elected member states of this Council to pronounce on the apocalyptic situation in Gaza. The main objective of this draft resolution was to address some of the most critical issues that currently feature in Israel's more than year-long war on Gaza. Those critical issues include the ongoing atrocities of a scale and intensity that caused the death toll to climb on a daily basis and which has now surpassed 43,000. The continued captivity of persons taken from Israel in the brutal attack of 7th of October, and the humanitarian situation that appears to have reached its nadir, but then still worsens in unimaginable ways. The resolution just considered responded to these critical issues, building on the legally binding framework that the Council had established through the 4 previous resolutions adopted since 7th of October. Importantly, this resolution would have gone further by adding several critical dimensions to that framework. Those include, for the first time, an unequivocal call for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, an affirmation of the centrality of UNRWA's role in the humanitarian response in Gaza, as well as an affirmation that respect for the International Court of Justice and its functions is essential to international law and justice, and to an international order based on the rule of law. Contemplating the end of the war and the mammoth investments that would be required for reconstruction, the resolution sought to make a contribution to day-after planning by requesting the Secretary General to prepare a comprehensive report which would include a needs assessment for Gaza in the short, medium, and long term. It is deeply disappointing, therefore, that these constructive contributions could not be added to the legally binding framework already in place on the war in Gaza. Madam President, many have said that the ongoing annihilation of the Palestinian people is a major stain on our collective human conscience. Today, the Council had the opportunity to begin erasing that stain by demanding an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire. But despite our best efforts and the almost universal support to go in that direction, the Council was again hamstrung by a veto. Guyana hopes that the inability of the Council to adopt this resolution will not be seen by those who want to continue this war as a license to continue killing, starving, and maiming innocent civilians. Madam President, the continuation of sheer misery cannot and must not be the fate of Palestinians. Their suffering must end. They need to see the seeds of peace being planted by this Council. They need to see that this Security Council is giving peace a chance. That hope was dashed today, but it has not been eclipsed. Guyana will continue to work with fellow council members to try to achieve tomorrow what we could not achieve today. Not trying is simply not an option. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement.
You know, we got ecological catastrophe and nuclear catastrophe impending, let alone the economic and moral and spiritual and political catastrophes that we're dealing with. And the elites tend to be not just unaccountable, but more and more they are extensions of big banks and big corporations under highly financialized monopoly capitalist civilization. And we see it in the schools, the privatizing, the pushing out of public spiritedness, pushing out of arts programs. You know, you see it in workplace where profits breaking records, but wages are stagnating. And we can go on and on. You see it in universities, I mentioned before, tied more and more to contracts and big money and outcome analysis in terms of who can produce knowledge that pays. Now, Edward Said turns over in his grave. You talk about knowledge that pays. How do you put a price on critical consciousness? How do you put a price on dignity? How do you put a price on integrity and honesty? They're priceless. But yet we in our market-driven world, looking for the short-term outcome. How Diane Ravitch puts it well when she says rich kids get taught and poor kids get tested. Because for the well-to-do, they still have time for the arts programs and so forth and so on. When it comes to our precious poor and working class kids, test, test, teachers, test, test. Charter, big money, and that threefold response of the neoliberals, which is always to financialize, privatize, militarize. Got a problem? Financialize, privatize, militarize. We'll take care of it. And what gets left out? Democracy, humanity, publicness. And that's the dominant tendencies of our day. So when you talk about elites lead, the masses bleed, that's a certain way of trying to unpack some of that. And that's what's so very, very important, it seems to me.